Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado State of Mind. Tonight, wildland fire in the West. Another summer of record destruction and firefighter deaths. Will these losses lead to a change in policy of how the region's forests are managed? We're set to talk about it this evening with Michael Kodas, a freelance journalist from Boulder who just returned from the fire at Yarnell, Arizona. He has covered firefighters, trained for firefighting, and is working on a book about all of this called Mega Fire, which will come out next year. Also with us, senior iNews reporter Kevin Vaughan, with news on the 4 million acres of forests in Colorado infected by beetle-kill. Are those areas of dead trees a tinderbox, a catastrophe waiting to happen, or not? There's disagreement about that. And from the Wildland Fire Science Laboratory at Colorado State University, Dr. Monique Rocca, who teaches forest management and fire ecology and has published numerous papers, including on the impact of beetle infestation. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, there are about 20 large fires burning now across the West, including the one in Arizona, which killed 19 elite hotshot firefighters. Michael, you've just come back. I understand that fire is contained as of just yesterday.
Yeah, that fire is 100% contained, and it's important to point out that that fire wouldn't be listed as one of the 20 large fires burning in the country right now, and probably it wouldn't have registered on the radar of the nation as an important wildfire if it weren't for the deaths of these hotshots and for the property that fire destroyed. And
it did destroy quite a lot. It isn't just trees.
No, it burned into the community of Yarnell and destroyed a number of homes, and that's one reason why those hotshots were where they were. They were really trying to put a line of defense between the burning chaparral and the community.
So when we say there are 20 large ones burning, there could be many other smaller ones that local jurisdictions are dealing with.
Many wildfires are burning right now, and the National Interagency Fire Center is really only going to list the ones that are very large or the ones that threaten life and property.
Kevin, I know you've covered many of these fires over the years. I was just realizing today I've covered the 1988 fire in Yellowstone. I remember being just amazed at the power of it. And we possibly have even more territory in Colorado that could go up.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the whole western half of the state is forested, and more it's populated. And you have that area they call the wildland urban interface, where you've got homes in the woods, which complicates the matter. And we've got, you know, 4.3 million acres of beetle-kill trees. There's debate about how that affects fire ecology, but you know, you have that issue, and then you have the whole reality of federal government policy for nearly a century was to put out every fire. And that and other factors have dramatically changed the ecology in the forest and changed the way fires burn in the forest.
So let's take a look at the map iNews has put together that sort of shows you the beetle-kill and the red zones.
Right, and we should define the red zone. It's areas where human settlement is interfacing with the forest, and it considers other factors like, you know, the slope of the terrain and the vegetation there. But basically you're talking about the forested Front Range, the I-70 corridor, some parts of southwestern Colorado, as a general rule of thumb, are areas they call the red zone. And you know, Michael was involved in research last year that shows, you know, in the previous decade, 100,000 people moved into the red zone in Colorado, and now 1 in 5 of the state's residents live in red zones. And the map shows that there are hundreds of thousands of acres of beetle-kill in the red zone.
Now, Monique, do you think that these dead trees, the beetle-kill, is that a worse, a more vulnerable situation than live trees?
The answer to that is that it depends a lot, and it's intuitive that when a tree has red needles on it, that tree is going to burn more readily. Anybody who's stuck a dead branch with pine needles into a campfire will know that will go up in flames. However, everybody who's stuck a branch without needles into a campfire to roast a marshmallow or something knows that will not burn as readily as a canopy that has red needles. And it's also important to note that green trees are very flammable in Colorado. So dry conditions will lead to fires in forests, whether the trees are green or whether they've been killed by mountain pine beetle. One of the things that this mountain pine beetle outbreak has done is made the public more aware of the fire hazard around their homes, and I think that's a good thing. I think there's a fire hazard around homes in the forest, whether the trees are green or whether they are red.
You know, every summer we start to realize how many more people are living in vulnerable areas, which is why fires are fought so aggressively, I believe. Is the insurance industry going to discourage people from moving into these areas?
Well, it's starting to show up in the insurance industry, but they've been pretty slow to respond to this. That, you know, as horrible as these losses are, it's not that big a loss for the insurance industry. Although a couple of years ago, Lloyd's of London announced that they were going to include climate-driven wildfire in their underwriting, and that has trickled down to other insurance companies. Now, sometimes it equates with insurance companies wanting to inspect and make sure that you're building fire-wise. You've got a metal roof on your house. You've got your propane tank a long way away from the house. But it's also manifested itself in these private firefighting companies where some insurers, like I believe ING is one of them, if you have the right policy, they actually will fly a private firefighting organization out to protect your home, and they'll go in and use retardants and things like that to save your home. So, you know, that's not necessarily going to help with the hazard before the fact, you know, if they're actually going to provide firefighting at the time.
That's another thing too, right, about the amount of money that is being spent on suppression of fire versus preparing areas so that they aren't as flammable.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, and it's complicated in my view by the fact that there's a lot of disagreement about the best way to manage the forest. You know, some people argue for logging and grazing, some people argue for thinning, some people argue for letting natural fires burn naturally. Unfortunately, a natural fire today is probably not going to burn the way it would have burned a century ago before, you know, we got into these conditions. I mean, fire historically has been sort of a rejuvenating force in the forest, and didn't jump up into the crowns of the trees and burn like a torch, you know, racing along the treetops like we see so much now, because the trees were so much bigger and healthier and more spread out, and a lot of times you had ground fires that burned through the grasses and cleaned out the duff and the brush, but didn't become these catastrophic fires. So the question is, you know, how do we try to get the forest back to a more historically natural condition?
So is that what it is, Monique? It's all this overgrown parts of the forest because fires have been suppressed?
In many of Colorado forests, that's the case. In the predominantly ponderosa pine forests that we find at the lower elevations and down in the lower southern part of our state, that is the case. There are also forest types in Colorado, such as lodgepole pine, spruce, fir, aspen, that grow in relatively moist, wet areas, and they're adapted to burn, adapted to regenerate following catastrophic fire. And the reason for that is that fires didn't occur as often in those places because they're so wet. The fires occurred maybe once every 100 or 200 years. And so when a fire came through, it was very severe. It tended to kill all the trees. And each of those species has a way of coming back and regenerating following fire. In those places, it's not so convenient to say that restoring the forest or thinning the forest or fireproofing the forest is the same as doing ecological healthy forest treatment. Whereas in the ponderosa pine forests, which were naturally less dense and naturally experienced low severity fire protection and restoration or ecological health tend to go more hand in hand.
We're also dealing with very severe drought in Colorado right now, which is not the case every year, but is climate change pushing us to this place of more fires?
Yeah, in Arizona, where I was just covering the fire, the Yarnell Hill fire, a report came out recently from Climate Central to show that that state is warming faster than any other state in the United States. And the warming and drying of the West is having a great impact on these fires. And when you've got an overfueled forest, you've got in effect some of these forests are slums of trees. They're so overcrowded that the trees themselves have to fight for nutrients, they have to fight for sunlight, and they have to fight for water. And if there's a drought in that forest, they're going to be that much more unhealthy and that much more prone to burn.
I just think of it this way. By some estimates, big swaths of the western forest today have 10 times as many trees per acre as they had a century ago. And so even if we weren't warming, even if we weren't in drought, you might have 100 trees fighting for the same amount of water that 10 trees that used to nourish 10 trees. So
that's a good way of thinking of it.
I'm not a scientist, but that just seems logical to me that you're going to have trees, fighting for more trees fighting for the same or now less water, and I believe that has to have an impact. I'm sure you could address that a little bit.
Competition between trees for resources is one thing that can contribute to bark beetle outbreaks, for example. The trees are weaker when there's a lot of competition, and that makes them less able to use their natural defenses to repel the bark beetle.
So, Michael, you wrote in a piece this week that I saw in Bloomberg that we should stop fighting the fires, just let them burn?
Well, there's certainly been a push for a couple of decades for let it burn policies. Now, those are policies that generally are applied to more remote forests, and we're talking about wilderness areas usually. And last May, the Forest Service circulated a memo that basically encouraged suppressing all fires, and that really outraged a lot of fire ecologists, both in and outside the Forest Service, because they really saw it as backtracking on a couple decades of policy that has shown really good effects. Last year in the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, they had the largest fire in New Mexico's history. But if you go to that area where those fires burned, where they let previous fires burn, the really big fire last year dropped to the ground. It was far less damaging. It did far less. It had far fewer impacts on the overall health of the forest. So there's other places like the Selway Wilderness and the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana where they've really seen a positive effect of letting fires burn. Obviously, you can't really do that when you're adjacent to communities, and so I think one of the big pushes now is to try to use our suppression resources and our forest health resources in areas close to infrastructure and homes that we want to protect, and let fires that are farther away from those places burn. This week there's a hearing in Congress, and Scott Tipton and Doug Lamborn were both two primary speakers at this hearing, talking about how to improve forest health. And there will be an increasingly heated debate about whether we need to have more logging, have more grazing in our forests, or whether maybe letting fires burn in the appropriate environment is going to be the best way to improve the health of our forests.
Monique, this federal policy has, well, Kevin mentioned earlier that for 100 years it was one thing. Is it slowly changing and evolving?
And until this setback with the Forest Service suppressing all fires, I think we were headed in the right direction. Recent fire policy has given incident managers more flexibility on how to fight any particular fire. They can let part of the fire burn up to a ridgetop, for example, and protect a different side of the fire. We were moving towards a policy in which we allowed more fire, or we could use fire for resource benefit and remove the distinction between fires that must be completely suppressed and fires that might be allowed to burn. So, and we also have stopped, I believe, putting firefighters in the way, we have stopped putting firefighters out in front of fires to protect wilderness. And I think that's a big improvement. I mean, that's happened over the last several decades. So now when firefighters are getting into trouble, and fire tragedies tend to be linked to protecting homes and communities.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that the hotshots who died in Arizona were part of a city fire department in Prescott, so they were within 30 miles of where this fire was burning. There were homes threatened. It's highly likely that some of these firefighters knew people in that community, and that probably drove them to maybe respond with more urgency and determination than they were even already known for. And there's a growing recognition that in that piece in Bloomberg, in fact, I wrote about the fact that now when you get trained for wildland firefighting, you get trained for what to do if you encounter a meth lab in the woods, or a marijuana grow, or an illegal waste dump. So there's an increasing recognition that forest firefighters are having to deal with urban problems because they're having to fight more and more fires that are in the wildland-urban interface, and that's presenting them with far more peril than they used to have to deal with.
I think we've also seen in this state in the last year a reality that surprised a lot of people, which is that man cannot control all fire. We saw it in Waldo Canyon last July, and we saw it in Black Forest last month. The firefighters in a lot of cases were helpless to do anything but stand there and watch the fire just devour home after home after home, because the force of nature, the force of those flames was so great. They just couldn't stop it. Somebody that I talked to for the story that we just ran made the point that we've sort of gotten this mindset that we can control the environment. We go out on a 100-degree day and we flick on our air conditioner in our car and we're cool and comfortable. But some of these fires are so intense and so incredible that man is basically powerless to do much about them.
Yeah, it's important to point out, and I don't think everybody in Colorado realizes that we've now broken our most destructive fire record in Colorado, destructive of property, 4 times in 4 years. It does seem to be that we're seeing almost an exponential increase in the severity of these fires, and at each one of those fires, and at probably a dozen others that I visited in my research, you hear the same thing from the incident commanders. We're seeing fire behavior we've never seen before, and we're having to pull firefighters off because we just don't know what this fire is going to do.
And climate change is something they point to, or is it just too complicated to say that?
No, I think they definitely point to climate change as being one of the drivers of this, and forest health, as we've discussed, being another one of the drivers. But I think the one thing that really has really complicated things for these men is the fact that there is so much more to protect in the wildland-urban interface. There are more houses, there's more infrastructure. We have watersheds that are severely threatened by these wildfires. All of the water in Denver is at risk at times from wildfires that burn up in the mountains.
Well, how do we move from the situation where firefighters have to protect all this infrastructure to some kind of different future? What would that different future be, and how would we get there?
Good question.
That's the $64,000 question that I don't have the answer for.
Yeah, no.
Well, I mean, honestly, I can say that having covered these fires in Colorado for 25 years now. People have been talking for all that time about the ways that homes should be constructed that are in the red zone, and it used to be there was a big push to get rid of shake shingles, and that's gone pretty far. But I'm still just shocked to go into the woods today of the forested Front Range and see lodgepole or pine trees and stuff right up against people's decks, branches up under the eaves of their home, their firewood pile nice stacked up underneath their elevated deck. I mean, all of that stuff is the kind of stuff that drives the destruction in these wildfires, and it's completely changing that is going to take a long time, I think, if it hasn't changed by now.
And whose responsibility is that? Is that a city or a county's responsibility to go to these homeowners and say, this is not acceptable?
Well, it probably should be those entities and others. The insurance industry should be involved in this, government should be involved in this, but it's pretty hard to address this many homes up in the mountains and change pretty big cultural attitudes. I still interview people all the time in really hazardous fire situations who will respond when you ask, why haven't you created a defensible space around your house? Why haven't you limbed up your trees? These aren't very hard things to do, and they will always say, well, we moved to the mountains for the trees, so we don't want to cut down the trees that we came here to be able to look at.
So they want to live in this natural setting and they accept the risk?
They do, but one thing that a fire scientist pointed out to me years ago when I started working on this is that those people who move there for the trees and think that they are living in this natural environment are living actually in a very unnatural forest when you're in these forests that have 10 times more trees than they're supposed to have. And we've culturally begun to see these overgrown ponderosa pine forests as the way a ponderosa pine forest is supposed to look. And a lot of these people, if you were to take them to some of these forests, like there are a number near Fort Collins that actually have been thinned out really effectively and said, well, this is the forest, the way it should look, they wouldn't be as interested in living in it.
I also think that human nature, no matter what the situation is to think it won't happen to me. And I think that, even with all of these catastrophic losses, I don't know what the total number of homes that have burned in the last 10 or 12 years in Colorado is, but it's a drop in the bucket to the total number of homes that are in the red zone. So I just think that the attitude, like Michael was saying, about wanting to live in the woods, and then the further attitude that the odds are still relatively slim. It's like getting hit by lightning, the odds are relatively slim, but some people do get hit by lightning occasionally,
I just had this conversation a few weeks ago with somebody who was living in exactly this kind of location, an old cabin and a shake roof, and the trees really grown in on them. And this is somebody with an advanced degree. And when I asked, are you concerned at all about wildfire? Their response was, well, we haven't had a fire here in 100 years. What are the odds? And I had to say, well, the odds are actually much higher because you haven't had a fire here in 100 years.
Monique, last question, actually going back to the question you posed a few moments ago. Do you think it's going to take some time, some cultural turnover to bring this to the place where it needs to be, where forests are thinned and natural as they should be?
If there were a shift in who's responsible for protecting homes in the communities from a federal-based system to more local management, then there might be more incentive for ordinances to be put in place for people to do defensive actions on their homes, protect their structures, put in defensible space around their homes. And that would be one step in the right direction for what is a large problem.
Thanks very much, Michael Kodas, Monique Rocca, and Kevin Vaughan, for your insights tonight on wildfire in Colorado and the West. Our last item this evening comes from reporter Steve Mort about a Florida doctor who has come to Colorado with his own unique brand of medical care, but he's just stopping here for a while because Thomas Klaus lives and travels in a caravan. He goes throughout the country to provide free rehabilitative services to people suffering from movement disorders, and these are conditions like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. Steve Mort talked with him recently when the caravan came to Aurora.
If your feet aren't happy and relaxed, your body's not relaxed.
Dr. Klaus teaches his patients what he's learned in his own battle for mobility as he fights a degenerative disorder called ataxia. When he was diagnosed in 1997, the symptoms, including what he calls extreme clumsiness, ended his career as a surgeon, but led him on a new path to develop techniques for people facing the same challenges.
It's not what we know, it's what we don't know we know. It's what we learned when we were in diapers. Get on the balls of your feet and do all that.
Relearning the very basics of walking by developing an awareness of exactly what your feet are doing.
Get the fishies!
That's at the heart of what Dr. Klaus teaches, sometimes using interactive video games. For Kerry Nakarato, who also suffers from ataxia, the training sessions have been invaluable.
Within a week, I was walking, came free, and feeling just more freedom and was moving more.
This training space is a bit cramped, but it's inside Dr. Klaus's caravan. He's based in Florida, but demand from around the U.S. pushed him to hit the road. He spends much of the year driving around the country, living in the caravan and working with patients who find him via his website.
These people are told there's really nothing we can do to help and you're only going to get worse. Well, I was seeing the opposite.
Since Dr. Klaus is offering what in essence is his own brand of rehabilitative treatment, it's not paid for by medical insurance. He treats his patients free of charge and depends entirely on charitable donations. He does that by working as inexpensively as possible. Here in Denver, he parks his caravan on an Air Force base, and a local hospital provides him with space to work with patients.
I need to push down.
22-year-old Jeff Wright says he's made progress after just a couple of weeks working with Dr. Klaus.
I do feel like it's starting to help my movement to become more normal-like, in a sense of walking and when people look at me to feel like they say that he's more normal than he was a couple of years ago.
Faster.
Dr. Klaus's long-term goal is to open up clinics staffed with physical therapists who've been trained in his techniques, but first he'll have to convince the U.S. medical community and health insurance industry to get on board, a process that could take years. For Colorado State of Mind, I'm Steve Mort.
And that is Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see this program again or any of our programs at video.rmpbs.org. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.